Last week on Tonic, we started a three-part series on a very common psychological problem, which often goes unrecognised and undertreated: anxiety. Every single one of us gets anxious from time to time. But there are people for whom their anxiety is disabling. They get feelings that are so unpleasant, they have to avoid situations that cause their anxiety. Today we're going to look at a time of life when anxiety often begins and is missed: childhood.
It's like an upset, sad feeling that you get when you're too worked up at something, or when you just like think you haven't done good enough and you're just like sad and gloomy and maybe a bit sick.
Anxiety in kids affects probably around about 5% of children. It's obviously very difficult often to decide sort of where anxiety, normal anxiety sort of starts and ends. But generally the way that we think of it is that where the anxiety starts to affect the child's life, it stops them having certain opportunities, or it stops them from getting on in the world, from doing important things like meeting other kids, going to school. That's where we'd start to say that it's become what you might call a problem, and it's worth doing something about it.
He'd cut a piece of paper out, and if it wasn't cut quite right, that would be enough to send him off. And he did try and get out of things that he didn't like doing.
His overreaction to relatively minor things, I suppose. So as Mandy said, you know, if you cut a piece of paper wrong, he'd get very upset very quickly to things that really were fairly minor issues.
I was a bit hysterical about some of my worries, and that didn't turn out very well.
Very cautious of anything new, even new food. So you'd put something new on his plate and he'd run off.
Probably the major things that parents would notice would be the avoidance and the ways in which that affects the child. So parents' lives themselves are often disrupted because the children will often get very upset when they have to do things that worry them or scare them. So good examples are, for example, a child that is scared of going to school. The parent will, of course, notice the child often having physical problems such as stomach aches or headaches whenever they've got to go to school, or they might start to cry, or in some cases even have tantrums.
You know, he's always been very social, lots of friends, can do sleepovers, but it's not a social thing for him where it's impacted his life in that way. It's more a general enjoyment, I suppose, of things. You know, if he can't do it well, then he doesn't want to do it type of scenario.
To what extent does an anxious child become an anxious adult?
Anxious children are at much greater risk to become anxious adults. A relatively large proportion of the anxious children do what we'd call grow out of it. That is, they do tend to develop coping skills and strategies, and they become less anxious, or at least the anxiety stops affecting their lives as they develop. But anxious children are probably about 2 to 4 times more likely to be anxious and depressed adolescents, and then in turn anxious and depressed adolescents are 2 to 4 times more likely to become anxious, depressed adults. And anxiety in childhood and teenagehood also increases the risk for other problems. I mentioned depression and also substance abuse.
Parents often beat themselves up about this sort of thing.
I think there's a very strong tendency these days to parent bash and to sort of start to blame parents for a whole range of problems, not just anxiety. And to some extent we're probably part of that problem.
Yes, I was quite similar. I probably still am a little bit similar, but I'm very perfectionist. So I was always, you know, if I got a bad, a C or not such a good mark, then I would get quite upset with myself. And again, it was nothing that my parents would have brought on me. It was just internal. And same with the playground. Like, I had quite a few friends, but I seemed to be worried about the ones that weren't my friends, which is the same as Lachlan. So, you know, you have your own circle of friends, but you worry why the other people don't want to be your friend, and that sort of takes over how you're feeling as a child, and that's Lachlan as well. So I suppose I didn't want him to go through that if I could, and for him to learn strategies now before it really sets in and he loses all his confidence.
Lachlan was lucky that his parents, Mandy and Grant, had insight into what he was going through and sought help for him. In other families who have an anxious child, the anxiety can be made worse by an overprotective response from the parents.
it comes very much from a sense of care about the child. So what happens is a very anxious parent, because they care so much for their child and they see the child, who themselves is anxious and distressed, in so much distress, they start to leap in earlier and earlier. And that's what we refer to as the overprotection. It's almost like a learned interaction between the parent and child, where the parent starts to anticipate what the child's going to be upset by and starts to jump in earlier and earlier to stop them from getting upset. So an example might be a young child who says, I've been invited to a party but I don't want to go because I'm too scared, I don't know any of the kids. And the overprotective parent might then say, oh, that's quite okay, don't worry, you don't need to go. So of course the parenting style that reduces anxiety is the opposite. It's the parenting style that is still very warm and caring and nurturing, but basically encourages and gently pushes the child to do the things that they're afraid of.
A bit hard if you're an anxious parent yourself.
Extremely.
So is the overprotective parent a person with anxiety too?
The overprotective parent is often more likely to have anxiety. It's not always the case that overprotection in a parent means that they're also an anxious parent, but they do tend to go together. We know that anxiety runs in families, and so anxious children often have anxious parents, and anxious parents, of course, do tend to be more overprotective because that anxious behaviour in the child pushes their buttons. It makes sense to them and they can relate to it, and so of course they then very quickly tend to jump in and anticipate difficulties.
To what extent does that mean then that you have to treat parents and children?
With a lot of our treatment programs, we do include the parents and we do encourage the parent to change.
The strategy is obviously really good for us as well, and I think it was quite broken into, there'd be children sessions and then the parents would have sessions, and it's funny how then I suppose it helps you in life as well.
I suppose I worry just like most other people do about normal things, and you know the program. What is interesting is that you see what Lachlan's gone through and the process we've been through over that period of time, and you do naturally apply it then to things that you worry about, like things for work or whatever else.
Tell me what you do in your programs.
Our programs tend to be very skills-based and really very common sense. One of the things that's crucial in anxiety is that people who are anxious tend to interpret situations in a very negative and very threatening way. And so what we do is we teach them how to look at the world more realistically.
Like if I was afraid of spiders biting me, I would use detective thinking most likely, and would think of all the other things that could happen, and we would think of all the thoughts against the negative idea. Like say a spider's never bit me, so it's probably not going to happen and stuff. And then we would have our more realistic thought at the bottom of our page.
Is basically getting kids to look at actual evidence for whether something will or will not happen. So to give you an example, if a child is worried that after school their parent will forget them and will not turn up, and so they'll be left at school and abandoned, we'll tell them to think about the evidence for that. We'll say, think about other times. How many other times have mum or dad ever forgotten you? How many times have other kids' parents forgotten them? So we encourage them to start to be very clever about thinking of evidence and actual data, if you like, to prove that what they're worried about is not going to happen. One of the next stages of treatment, and probably the most important part, is what we refer to as exposure technically, or we've referred to it with our clients as step ladders. And basically it involves getting the children to start to face their fears, start to do the things they're afraid of.
Can you give me an example?
So an example might be a child who's afraid of meeting other children and going up and talking to new kids at school. We might get them to think about some sorts of children who are not as scary as others. And they would practice going and talking to those children over and over and over again until they get used to it and overcome that fear. And once they've done that, then they would pick some children perhaps who are a little bit scarier.
I really liked it. All the instructors were really nice, and all the other kids were really nice. It was a great experience, and they helped me heaps.
Loved it, and the kids really got on well, and they really had fun. I think they could really, identify with each other. So I think that's what it's about. And I think it's about them not feeling like they're the only child and they're the only person that feels like that.
And what sort of results do you get?
We get really good results. Our programs go for about 12 weeks, and at the end of 12 weeks we find about 60% of their children no longer meet technical criteria for an anxiety disorder. So that means that doesn't mean that they're completely laid back kids, but it means that they no longer have major life interference from their anxiety disorder. And that percentage goes up to 70-75% over the following sort of 3 to 12 months.
Like you start off with a pre-interview to begin with, and then you have to do some online surveys and things like that. You do a cheek swab, I think, to see if it's hereditary. So I'm guessing it is. But so it's for us, I suppose it's over as far as the group sessions, besides the interview. But obviously it's something that it's not supposed to just be a fix that happens over the 10 weeks. It's supposed to be things that you build on and use the strategies you use for the rest of your life to keep it under control.
How young can you treat?
The way we think about our preschool children program is that it's really more of a prevention program. So what we're doing is selecting children who are very, very inhibited, which refers to children who are shy and withdrawn, who tend to sort of cling to their mother a lot of the time, who don't tend to venture out terribly much. And we see these children as being potentially at risk for later anxiety. We've started doing a program where we teach their parents a very brief period of 6 sessions, education about how they can help their own child. And this program seems to be doing some great things. And we find that several years later, the kids whose parents have been through this program are less likely to have anxiety problems.